Elaine Bensted is the Chief Executive from Zoos South Australia. Elaine commenced now in 2012. Since being in the role, Elaine has led an improvement in the financial position of this conservation charity, as they're referred to now, and an increase in Zoos SA membership base from 26,000 to over 43,000. Elaine has also led the work that's culminated in the release of a 20-year master plan for both Adelaide and Monarto zoos in early 2015. And we all know at one stage perhaps nobody else would have contemplated a 20-year plan, Elaine. Prior to being appointed as Chief Executive Zoos SA, Elaine has also held the position of Chief Executive Officer of TAFE SA. Elaine has previously also held senior positions in other state and local government and the private sector in the finance industries. Her qualifications include an MBA and a Masters in Public Policy and Management. Elaine was a recipient of the 2014 Australian Institute of Management Not-for-Profit Management Award, a board member of many important boards. Elaine comes to us to talk about her views and her thoughts on her career and the link to leadership. Elaine Bensted.
Now I'm up here, I have to stay up here. I've just had a knee surgery and the stairs are a bit of a challenge. Can you all hear me fine? Because I'm sort of plugged in, I'm not sure which one he's using. So I'm going to talk about leadership and change and a little bit about the Zoos SA journey. And of course throughout this, because I do note that I'm the last speaker between you and drinks, so apart from listening to me, you will get to see some pretty cute animal photos. There is no shame when you're a zoo director, you can show as many cute animal photos as you like. They're our little cheetah cubs, now about 8 kilos, but mum's about 50 kilos, so they're growing pretty quickly, but they are very, very cute. It's usually a good start to turn it on. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about Zoos SA, who we are, but I'm going to talk about our change journey, and in part I'll talk about my change journey through that, because obviously I didn't come from a zoo background. As you heard, my previous role to this one was Chief Exec at TAFE, and I was there for 7 years. So people often say, you know, how do you go from TAFE to a zoo? And then you get all the jokes. And I can assure you that my animals are so much more better behaved than many of the TAFE students that we dealt with. But we will talk about the journey, because when I started at Zoos SA, we were in very serious financial difficulty. I think most people in South Australia knew that. So to get from there to where we are now, we have had to implement a lot of change. So I'll just be talking mainly about not the financial bit of how we achieved that, but more from a human and a behavioural change, leading the people change part of that. So as you heard, we're a conservation charity, and many people in South Australia don't know that. They think of the zoo as being part of government, much like the Botanic Gardens or the State Library. And it's understandable that the community think that, because most of the rest of the zoos in Australia are arms of their state government. So if you think Taronga, Perth, Melbourne, they are all run by their equivalent departments of environment. And Zoos SA isn't. And that's just a fact of history. So it was 139 years ago that what was then called the Acclimatisation Society was formed by a couple of gentlemen who then travelled the world and grabbed animals from wherever and put them in a place to show the people of Adelaide. And it's gone through a number of iterations since then, but it has always been a private organisation. And would that ever change? I don't think so. Number one, our members would need to agree to that change, and I don't think that would happen. Number two, the government would want to have us, and zoos are really expensive to run. So I think they'd quite happily have us being independent. I talk to my counterparts from around Australia regularly, and you know, I always say the one advantage they have is they have much more money than we do. We have much more control. So I report to a board, so we're incorporated under the Associations Act. I report to a board, and so we really drive our own business and drive our own destiny. If we want to implement something I take it to the board, we get a quick decision, we move forward. And I know that in government that doesn't always work quite as quickly and easily. Certainly in TAFE, you know, if I wanted to run a marketing campaign, you had to start that work about 6 months before you were going to run it, because they had to go to Premier and Cabinet and all of those process, ministers' offices. And by the time you went to run it, it was sort of out of date. So we don't have that. We do have a lot of autonomy, but not quite as much money. And our purpose or our mission, our reason for being is really very simple. It's to connect people with nature and to save species from extinction. And that is a really easy statement, really challenging to achieve, but critically important when we look at the world that we're in today. And you look at the number of species that are on the edge of extinction, the number that we've already lost, and the loss of a lifestyle that, especially for children, they're no longer out in nature, going tadpoling in the morning or whatever it is. The way that we sort of grew up, a lot of children don't get that. So unless they get that exposure to nature, they're unlikely to love it. And if they don't love it, they're unlikely to want to protect it. So for us, it's a really, really critical mission. But if I go back 5 years, so 5 years ago, I think most people in South Australia know the zoo was in quite a serious bit of financial trouble. I don't know if all South Australians know quite how serious that trouble was. But in effect, there was a large debt. People blame the pandas. Poor Fooni and Wong Wong cop an awful lot of blame. The reality was the zoo had undertaken a lot of development, including the panda exhibit. But the debt was nearly 25 million. The panda enclosure was about 9 million to build. So, you know, it wasn't all about the pandas. There was a thing called a global financial crisis, impacted an awful lot of businesses, including the zoos, because we do get some money from government. Most of our money comes from stuff that we earn ourselves. So our visitors coming to see us, our members, and corporate sponsorship. GFC, what's the first thing that goes? Corporate sponsorship. So there was a whole lot of reasons, but the end result was the zoo was in a position where it had a debt that it couldn't pay, it had an awful lot of bills that it couldn't pay, it had staff superannuation that it wasn't paying, and so it was in really serious trouble. And to the stage where there was discussions about closing the zoo, appointing administrators, all of that sort of stuff. So not unexpectedly, staff morale was about as low as it could get, because the staff were reading about what was happening in the newspapers. They didn't know what was true, what wasn't true. They weren't being told a lot of the full facts. Previous chief executive left, so there was an acting management team. So it was a pretty ugly, nasty time. And the visitor numbers were dropping. And I said that's the core of our revenue, is our visitors. They came in droves after the pandas arrived. So we had record numbers, and then it started drifting back. But the expenditure base that had been built up to support that growth was there. That didn't drop as quickly. It's a really common story with businesses around the world, really. But in amongst all of that, the animal work, the core of what the zoo is about, was continuing and being really successful. So running the zoo as a business wasn't going quite so well, but running the zoo as a conservation area focused on saving species was going really well. That creature there is a Mongolian Przewalski horse, so it's a wild horse of Mongolia. And I use this as an example because that horse was actually extinct in the wild. There was none left at all. And yet there was a sudden realisation that quite a number of zoos around the world hold Przewalski horses. So there's probably a reasonable genetic mix. And it was probably the first example of a global zoo campaign to save a species from extinction. So a number of zoos got involved in a breeding program, including Minato Zoo, started breeding up pea horses and releasing them back to the wilds of Mongolia. So some of our Mongolian Minato bred horses went from a 43-degree summer in Minato over to about a -35 in Mongolia. They're now breeding in the wild. So while the zoo was going really badly financially, money-wise was going great. Now people have often asked me, so why did you apply for the chief exec's job when you read all of this stuff? because everybody knew about it. And I'd been 7 years as Chief Executive at TAFE. It had changed iteration of Deputy CE of DeFeast, and as government entities do, title changed, but I'd been responsible for TAFE, and TAFE was a fantastic organisation. So why make that move? And for me, it was nothing more. It was just as simple as a Saturday morning, opening a newspaper on the dining room table, and I saw the job advertised. And the first thought was, wow, wouldn't that be a cool job? And I see Rick Pearce every now and then, and he does still say, you've got the best job there is, because who wouldn't want to work in a zoo? I grew up, my entire childhood, I wanted to be a vet. It was the only thing I ever wanted to be, until I got to about year 12 and realised I'm really squeamish. And so if there's blood, I'm fainted on the floor. And I kept thinking I would grow out of it, and realised in year 12 that, no, I'm not going to grow out of it. So I really then changed career. I had no idea what I was going to do. So I went to university and I was doing a science degree because all of my subjects were based around being a vet. And then I dropped out because I didn't want to be a scientist. I wanted to be a vet. And I literally sent off a letter, because in those days it was really easy to get a job. And I wrote to the banks, and I got a job in what was then Bank of Adelaide. And that was meant to be for 6 months. And then I was going to go back to uni. Well, I stayed there for 17 years, did all sorts of other things, then went into local government. Ended up being the training manager, the national training manager for ANZ. So that was sort of the education link that then went into TAFE. So put all of that aside and then open up a newspaper after 7 years in a pretty full-on job in TAFE. Very political at that stage. We were going through a lot of legislative change to separate TAFE to be a statutory authority. And you suddenly see a job ad in a zoo, and something went ding. It's taken me about 35 years, but I'm almost going to get to be a vet. And so I rang up the recruitment agency and said, I know nothing at all about running a zoo, but I do know about running a business. Are you interested in chatting? And then it all happened really quickly, and then I suddenly thought, ooh, now what do I do? Because then I had to actually work out what I was going to do. I did do the due diligence on the financials, and I was pretty sure that we could make it work. Not that silly. So where are we now? It was fantastic that last financial year we've had our record, so the highest ever visitor numbers in the 134 years that we've been open to the public. So it actually surpassed the panda year, because the panda year was huge. We've now got above that number in a very sustainable way, because it's based on a whole lot of different things, not just on one species. Our membership numbers have now got up to over 45,000. Every time I quote a number, it keeps going, and that's fantastic. From a financial base, that really strengthens our link, but it also gives us a connection with people. If you're a casual visitor, we see you once. If you're a member, you're on our database. You get fortnightly newsletters that tell you what's happening. You get to be part of the zoo family, so that connection is much, much stronger. We are in financial surplus. It's not a big surplus, but it doesn't need to be, but at least it's the right colour, and we're paying off the debt, which would be lovely not to have it, but most people in life have a debt. We're no different, but we are repaying it. And as you heard, we've got plans for the future. This one here I was really pleased with. As I said, our staff morale was really, really low, like could not have been lower. This is the results from our staff survey that we did earlier this year. And we asked people about their engagement with our vision, our mission and our values. And the average of those three came up to just under 95%. I instantly, my brain, when it looks at numbers like that, says, oh, what a bugger that it wasn't over 95. I hate being just under 95, but it's a pretty engaged workforce. And with what we do, that is so important, because certainly our staff don't work for the money, because we are a not-for-profit charity, so our salaries are significantly lower than, if you look at my vets, they could earn probably 4 times in the private sector what they earn with the zoo. Their variety of animals that they work with would be a bit more limited, so it's a pretty exciting veterinary job. But that is so critical for us, because it's our staff that engage with our visitors, and if our mission's about connecting people with nature, it's the staff that do that connection. And so keeping that engagement's important. So how did we do it? And I'm not going to go through all of this because I'm going to concentrate on the change leadership style, but we did have to change governance, We changed a lot about just simple business practices and how you run the zoo. A lot of leadership, and I'll talk a little bit about those different elements. So it did have to start at the top. We changed our constitution. Our board previously was made up of members who nominated, and then there was an election. So you got who you got. And you generally got a group of very, very passionate conservationists and very, very passionate conservationists and very, very passionate conservationists. Around the table, you didn't have diversity. There wasn't anyone who was challenging the finances. There was no marketing expertise, legal, and any board needs to change that. So we've changed that, but that went right through the whole structure of the organisation. And governance to me is just about who can make what decision. And is that really, really clear to everybody about who can make what decision? So that clarity of authority is important. And I'm not sure how schools operate, but certainly in TAFE I used to find that really grey. You'd have your formal delegation manuals, and I'm sure you've all got formal delegation manuals. But then you've got how things really work. And then quite different. So even though someone might have the delegation, they call for a committee. And you think, well, why not just, if you've got the delegation, why not just make the decision? So there seemed to be just a variance around that. So we spent a lot of time making sure that that was clear. We also really talked about vision. And making sure that everyone was clear about our purpose. And trying to, and we've got better at this, but we haven't got it perfectly yet, is that, so for every PDP is our personal development plan, so your own performance plans, individual plans. We want every single person, no matter what your role is, to be able to see their goals in their personal plan. How does that link to the business plan, and how does that link to the strategic plan? And if the staff member can't see that link, then we ask them to hold their hand up and say, not clear to me. I don't know if I'm the horticulturalist keeping the gardens of Adelaide look as beautiful as they do. How is that going to help us achieve something? And if their manager can't explain that, then the manager hasn't done their job properly, is the way I view it. So it's really clear and important for everybody. And I said, we're not quite there, but I think we're a lot closer than we were. I've spent a lot of time on KPIs, and to me they're probably the single most important thing about achieving the change that we have, is making sure that everybody knows what is important and how you're going to measure it. And I challenged a lot of government agencies about that point. If you ask people what is the most important measure, and you know, I came from TAFE, the old, when you get ready for budget estimates and you've got to do all of your budget reporting against all of your KPIs, and there was thousands of them, there were so many measures, but I said, what's the most important measure? And if you ask that for your schools, what is the most important measure of your success? Would everybody who works in your school be able to answer that the same way? And if you can say yes to that, or what are the top 5, then you go a long way to getting everybody absolutely on the same page. So we did spend an enormous amount of time on KPIs, down to the nth degree, and then we make them public. So I send an email to all my staff, talk about change. In TAFE I took that for granted. First week in the job at the zoo, go to send an email to stuff, no, don't have an email system that has everybody on it. Okay, okay. We'll need to find another way to communicate and then build the email system. But we're really public about attendance numbers every Monday. It's how are we tracking to budget, all of those different things. Things like staff surveys, all of those results, very, very public. So you've got to make it measurable and you've got to talk about it and be really clear and honest when you say, this one's not tracking well. So what are we going to do about it? How do we change that? Leadership is probably, you can tell I like cheetahs. I'm a little bit obsessed with cheetahs at the moment because of our 5. Leadership is really, really important. And obviously we had to make some tough decisions. And in some ways, when you talk about context, it was easier in 2 ways at the zoo. One was, I didn't need to convince anybody that we had to do things differently, because they say they create the burning platform. Our platform was on fire. So everybody knew we had to do something differently. But the other thing was we had the control. So if we wanted to do something differently, we could. I could take a proposal to the board, get a fairly quick decision. So within the first few months, we made the decision to close Warrawong, our business at Warrawong Sanctuary. And that was not a popular decision, certainly by the community standards, but it was the only way forward for the position we were in. So you just make that decision. And I say context is important because I was always prepared to make tough decisions. I can live with tough decisions. In TAFE, you'd have to recommend it to a minister. Ministers weren't always quite as brave or didn't want to make that decision depending where it was in the electoral cycle, all of that sort of stuff. So that ability to implement change in some ways is easier when you've got that control. And you do need to look at leadership from the front. It's not all the rah-rah standing at the front leadership, it's also standing at the rear. Now, if I hit the wrong button, I'll switch it off, so I won't try and point. This is a beautiful photo. How many of you have seen this before? It's done the circle. Yeah, see, Facebook just spreads the word of these sort of things. But this is a beautiful photo of wolves and how wolves, Arctic wolves, travel. And it's showing that the three out the front are the three really strong fighters. So they're out protecting from any predators. Then there's a range of the old and the weak, and they're in the middle. And the wolf that's right at the back is the pack leader. Just watching, making sure, scanning that everything is safe. And to me, I really, really like that analogy because it's about bringing the group forward. I don't know if any of you have seen a person speak called Simon Sinek who talks about the circle of safety, and that unless your staff feel safe, they're unlikely to make brave decisions or sort of really push themselves to the limit. It's a little bit like what wolves do. African wild dogs do the same thing. They'll just circle around and protect those that are weakest. So leadership is sometimes about being out the front. An awful lot of times it's being at the back. Sometimes it's right in the middle, and it's, you know, digging mulch or doing whatever has to be done to save a bit of money. How many of you have seen the new Nature's Playground at Adelaide Zoo? Any of you who've got children hopefully have seen it. We made a commitment we were going to open it by Christmas, and everyone told us that we were crazy, it wasn't going to happen. Well, it did, but it only happened because I literally had every single person in the zoo shoveling mulch and planting trees, including the finance team. I've got to say, if you ever want to make a horticulture manager happy, just say, here's the finance director, here's your lackey for the day, working really hard. And he did. We had to look at our stakeholders, and I'd suggest all of you, this is a really interesting exercise to do. Do your own stakeholder map. Who are your stakeholders? And then ask yourself, what is it that they want? So can you really clearly define who your stakeholders are and what is it that they want to achieve, and how would they measure the relationship and what they're getting out of it? Because until you really understand that, it's hard to develop action plans. And oftentimes it's, you know, well, the bank wants us to do this, but our sponsors want us to do that. And people tended to think that it's always a choice and you can do this or you can do that, rather than think, can we do both? Can you find a solution that implements both? So for me, I'll finish talking about driving behaviour, because that was really the key, was getting our staff to do things differently. And if you think if you were a zookeeper, what is it that motivates you? Actually the animals. Like, they became a zookeeper because they're passionate about their animal, and they are passionate about their animals, whether it's snakes, reptiles, carnivores, primates, birds, you know, they all have their own passion. A lot of them didn't actually like people that much. That's why they became a zookeeper. And all of a sudden you've got someone coming from completely outside the zoo world saying, we need to earn more revenue, therefore I want you to talk to the public a little bit more, because that's what the public tell me they want, and I want you to do behind the scenes experiences so that, you know, we can raise more money and increase our connection. How did I get the what's in it for me for those keepers? When we train our animals, we use a thing called positive reinforcement. So I'm sure many of you have trained a dog at some stage. You've got them on a lead when you start. You can't do that with a hyena or a lion. So, but we do training for them. So you have to be able to make the animal want to change behaviour. And we use a positive reinforcement. And it allows us to do things like our free flight show. So we let our birds out and they fly from one area to the other. But it takes about 6 months to train the bird to do that. We start, one hand to one hand. It's a really slow exercise. And positive reinforcement behaviour training works for what we call our humanimals, which is our staff. So you had to work out what behaviours do you want the staff to show, and can you define that? And if you can define it, you then try and set up the environment where they can be successful. You don't try and train a dog for the first time by taking it to the middle of a school oval where there's kids playing footy, because the dog's not going to succeed. So you find a really quiet space. You make sure the dog's had food. You make sure and then you do a little short bit of training, reward it when it gets it right. It's exactly the same with staff. If you want staff to change, you're asking them to do something different to what they're currently doing. So define what it is, set the environment so that they can most likely be successful, catch them doing it right, and then reward them. It's no different to training an animal. The rewards might be a bit different, or not. Food works for most. So to summarise, leading change, I think for me the key lessons are no different in context. If I looked at the private sector, if I looked at TAFE, if I looked at the zoo, the number one thing is always about communication. Can you communicate the what's in it for the other person? If you want them to change, why will they want to change? And if you can't describe it in something that's meaningful for them, I'd suggest they won't change. You've got to build credibility. You need to measure and know what's important, and your staff need to know what's important. Passive resistance, this is one thing I found different in context with the zoo and TAFE. TAFE was the classic master at passive resistance. You'd go to a meeting and everyone would nod and say they were going to do things differently, and then they would go back to their campuses and absolutely nothing would change. And I saw in government an awful lot of that, because the change was about structure or process, but the fundamentals didn't change, the behaviours didn't change. And I think if you really want to drive change, people's behaviour needs to change. And if you can get that behaviour change because people want to do it, you're much more likely to be successful. So getting the middle managers involved is really important. And I always finish reminding whoever I speak to that we are a conservation charity, and there's a whole lot of ways that you can help us. Because the zoo almost disappeared from the South Australian landscape, and that would have been an absolute tragedy. You think of future generations growing up not having a zoo to visit. And I certainly don't ever want the zoo to be in that position again. So I always remind people that there's a myriad of ways that you can help. And I don't think we're going to have discussion and questions, but I am going to hover around for drinks. But I am going to be pulling a draw. Don't you love those for knobbly knees? That's a little baby giraffe. Now we have donated a behind-the-scenes experience to help put our lions to bed. It's a pretty exciting experience. You get up close with our lions at Monarto. So I think everybody's names are in. And if anyone has a big cat phobia, you might want to give it away, because you do get very up close and personal. Sharon Illingworth from Heathfield High. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the discussion and your generosity. You would have noticed just a slight hesitation there, but at no stage did Elaine even suggest that she wouldn't get up here and be with us in terms of giving her speech this afternoon. And Elaine has donated her time, and we would like to donate something for your recovery. Elaine, we certainly hope so. So thank you once again.
Thank you very much.